Hello, everyone. On behalf of the CCCU, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. Dan Nelson and Jeff Olson have spent more than 2 decades conducting surveys and compiling data from CCCU institutions on affordability and institutional financial health. And we are very excited for the opportunity to hear from both of them today.
This is Dan Nelson, and I'm the Chief Institutional and Data Officer at Bethel University in St. Paul, Minnesota. And I've been conducting surveys of Christian schools since 1988 for 11 years with a small group called the Christian College Consortium. And then for the last 22 years together with Jeff Olson of the CCCU. A bit about the process we go through to collect this information. We start in August putting together the questions. We collect input from the CCCU, try and ask questions that help their legislative agenda on Capitol Hill, and then ask questions that financial aid officers want to know about. Then in September, we release the survey, have a deadline in late October, analyze it in November, and then we prepare a presentation to financial aid folks, which this year was done virtually on the 15th of December, and Jeff will do a quick recap of that. And then we prepare a second presentation, which typically we go to either the mini academic conference for chief enrollment officers. We've also presented to chief financial officers on trends in affordability and institutional financial health. What we realized about 7-8 years ago is that the data that we had about financial aid lent itself to looking at some of these trend issues. And so we look at affordability, which we define as the ability of the families who want to go to our schools to pay for our schools. And that's student by student, family by family. And institutional financial health is from the perspective of the institution. How well are we maintaining our revenue year over year? And so the data that we collect speaks to both of these issues. In the process of putting this together, we're greatly aided by Steph Holm. And Steph, I'll ask you to unmute and introduce yourself and explain how you will help with questions today.
Thanks, Dan. I'm Steph Holm, and I'm the Senior Research Lead in Institutional Data and Research at Bethel University, and I work on the back end of the survey. I build it in Qualtrics and administer it, and then help Dan and Jeff with all the cleanup of the data. And today, I get to monitor the Q&A feature. So any questions you have as we go along, submit them through the Q&A. And then we will have, towards the end of the presentation, a time to answer those questions. And now here's Jeff.
Hi, I'm Jeff Olson. It's my joy to work with Steph and Dan and to participate in this survey. A while back, somebody asked me what my idea of a favorite vacation destination or activity would be. And frankly, it would be working in an Excel spreadsheet. And so working on this particular survey gives me lots of opportunity to dig into the data in Excel and find ways to present it, and hopefully in ways that are clear and understandable. Every session, it seems like I have at least one slide that is not that. So watch for that slide today. But we're going to go ahead and jump into the presentation. And here's the overview. I'll take a little bit of time, as Dan mentioned, to hit the highlights of the content that we presented to the financial aid crew back in December. But the bulk of the presentation today will be focusing on affordability and the trends in institutional financial health. From that, we'll talk a little bit about characteristics that we see of these healthy institutions, provide some additional opportunities for more information if you want to do that after the presentation. And then we really look forward to your questions and answers and look for an opportunity to discuss that together. Well, let's jump into the highlights of the financial aid survey. This past cycle, we had 55 schools that participated, and you can see the representation here. In the CCCU, there are about 141 active CCCU institutions that participate in undergrad programs. And so of the 141, about 55 are the ones that participated this last cycle. Over the last 10 years, 34 schools have participated every year. They're just regular participants in the survey, and that we're so grateful for, because that helps us to have a better foundation as we're looking at year-over-year comparisons. The 136 schools have participated at least once since the first survey. And the key to keep in mind is it's not exactly the same group of schools who are participating every year. And so we will sometimes talk about year-over-year comparisons where schools provided 2 or 3 years worth of data in the single survey. Frequently, we're comparing data from 1 year survey to another year survey. And so there's a little bit different composition, but the core are these schools here, the 34. And then the schools you can see in red, those are schools that have participated in all 22 years. In terms of the highlights of this past survey, these are the topics we'll be focusing on. And I'm going to jump right into that. If you want a copy of the previous survey, it's available on the website, and the URL is here. A copy of this presentation will be sent out to all participants following the webinar today. In the most recent survey of the 55 respondents, this is the breakdown of the type of populations of students that are enrolled. Everybody enrolled some type of traditional undergrad. That's the primary focus of our survey. 91% report graduate students and 76% report non-traditional. But most of our conversation today will focus on the traditional undergraduate programs. We were curious about the impact COVID-19 had on financial aid and admissions operations. So we asked this question: did your institution make any fall 20 pricing changes in response to the COVID pandemic? And 28% reported that they changed their fall sticker price. Sometimes that was through an extra grant targeted just for students this past fall, sometimes some other type of sticker price. 4% reduced their tuition for online instruction, and then 13% reduced their room or board charges. We also were curious about the impact on retention and enrollment. And so we asked just a real simple question: was your retention for fall of 20 significantly below, up to significantly better? And in most cases, 78% of the time, the respondents said it was at least similar to prior years or maybe a little bit better. Not quite the same story on new student enrollment. And 68% of the respondents indicated that enrollment for fall of 20 was less than, slightly below, or significantly below enrollment from fall of 19. If you want to see some more information outside of the CCCU on the relationship between COVID-19 and retention or enrollment, I encourage you to check out the Sallie Mae report, How America Pays for College 2020. The URL is here on the slide. Otherwise, you can just Google How America Pays for College. And then once you get into the report, search for COVID, and they've asked a few questions, and it's interesting information there on the broader impact of COVID on higher ed this past cycle. We asked one question on income share agreements, and we've asked this for a couple of years. This is the 2020 response. The idea of an income share agreement, I'm guessing most of you are familiar with. And the idea is it's not a loan, it's not a grant, it's something kind of in between. And this is showing under what circumstances are schools currently using income share agreements for retention, to replace unfunded institutional gift aid for new freshmen, to replace loans for new freshmen, or to offer some type of an income share agreement to parents. And what we're seeing is the blue are schools who have been doing this prior to the 2021 school year. Red is 2021. Green are schools that are planning to initiate some type of income share agreement for the 21-22 school year. And so we can see that right now, less than 10% of our schools are participating or using some type of income share agreement. There seems to be a fair amount of interest, in particular in using this to aid retention. We also asked some questions about tuition reductions, and this is looking at current and former CCCU member institutions who have launched some type of a tuition reset or tuition reduction in recent years. 3 schools have announced that they will do a tuition reset for the 21-22 school year. Houghton College, Gordon, and Seattle Pacific. And it's interesting when you look at the far right column, the percent change in tuition. Toccoa Falls College this past year launched a tuition reset, and their reset went down 9% in tuition. This upcoming school year, 21-22, Seattle Pacific is going down 25%, Gordon is going down 33%, and Houghton College is going down 53%. So very different perspectives on how they're approaching the tuition reset. Again, encourage you, Google these schools and look at their websites to see how they're describing the reasons why they're going through some type of a tuition reset and the way they're using the tuition reset to get at this affordability and value question. Gordon, on their website, they talk about the excellence should be affordable is the way they're describing this. And they say it's time to dispel the myth that a college measures its quality by the sticker price. And the decades-old game of high sticker price, high financial aid is one students ultimately lose and has closed the door to many families who expect excellence and affordability in choosing a private Christian college experience. That's a quote right from the Gordon website. Again, check out their websites for a more detailed explanation of what they're doing with their tuition resets. Another question that we asked, there we go, had to do with the timing of when are schools sending out their initial financial aid offers to incoming new students. And we've asked this for several years, such a big shift with the FAFSA becoming available as early as October 1, the fall of the senior year for high school seniors. And so over the last 3 years, respondents to the surveys, it looks like 46% this most year were sending out the initial financial aid offer in November. Another third, we're sending it out in December. So for fall of 21, we're about 80% of our schools are sending out the financial aid offers to incoming new students prior to the end of the calendar year. We asked on a rotating basis, how many of you have purchased or used some type of a leveraging product or hired a leveraging consultant to help you with your financial aid packaging over the last 5 years? And this is the response to that question over the last 4 surveys, going all the way back to fall of 08. And what's interesting is in the fall of 20 survey, all but 2 of the responding schools said, yes, they've hired some type of a consultant to help with their financial aid packaging. Such a shift from prior years where it was 50, 60% of schools to now it's well over 90% of our schools. And it's indicative of the challenges and pressures that we're all facing as we strive to find a way to expand the kingdom by allowing students to benefit from the educational opportunities at our schools. We asked a couple questions about the types of scholarships, and this slide looks at academic scholarships for entering new students. And again, we're comparing the survey results over the last 4 cycles. And what struck us was that back in 2008, at CCCU schools, the median percent of incoming students who received some type of academic scholarship, it was 62%, 2 out of 3. And for the fall of 20, the median was 90%. At half of our schools, 90% of incoming students receive an academic scholarship. The third quartile has jumped up to 99.9. Almost everybody that's being admitted to our schools, at 25% of our schools, everybody is getting some type of an academic scholarship. We also asked some questions about targeted scholarships. And those of us who work in the financial aid office talk with our friends in the admissions office, and they say, hey, such and such a school is offering this targeted scholarship. We should do that too. And so this is showing the results from the last 3 cycles. This is a question that we ask on a 4-year rotation. And we're able to see that the most common targeted scholarships continue to be the child of a pastor or missionary. Some of us are participating in athletic programs that allow us to offer athletic scholarships, and then funds for international students or church match. And beyond that, it drops off more substantially with these other types of targeted scholarships. This slide, you can see at the top, it says, see pages 225 to 254. And this is one of the unique features of the survey that we do is the participants receive a report that indicates of all of the participating schools, how did you respond to the question? So if you were curious to say, I wonder how the school down the street responded to this question about targeted scholarships, you can reach out to your financial aid office if they participated in the survey. they'll have this report, and you could look at pages 225 to 254 and see for individual schools what types of targeted scholarships and the size of those scholarships that they're offering. We also were interested and a little surprised at the change in what limits the amount of institutionally controlled grants and scholarships that students can receive. And this is comparing the survey from 4 years ago and the most recent survey. And what we're seeing is an increase in the cap. 4 years ago, 23% of the responding schools said that the most institutional gift aid they would offer would equal cost of attendance, the tuition, room and board, books and supplies, personal expenses. And that now has jumped to 54% of the responding schools. So that's a cap on how much institutionally controlled gift aid that they would allow students to receive. Significant change over the past 4 years. This next section, we're beginning to transition into more of the affordability. And as Dan mentioned, this is affordability from the perspective of the student and the parent. So we're looking at the topics here, the tuition and fees, student aid and debt, loan defaults, as well as then affordability at some select peer institutions. Many of the slides that you'll see, the legend is going to be really small on the slide. And so this is looking at the legend, and we've tried to use the same colors throughout all of the slides. Most of the time, we're going to draw attention to the median, and that's going to be this olive green color. First quartile is purple, third quartile is the gold color, and so half of our schools are someplace in that area. Some of the slides will have a minimum or a maximum, and a couple slides will have the average, which is going to be this pink area. But watch for the green. That's the median response for the CCCU institutions. Here's tuition and fees. And for tuition and fees, we asked the question on the survey, but we also go out and Steph each year looks up the tuition and fee information on the CCCU websites for schools that did not participate in the survey. And when a school jumps into the survey for the first time, we go back and pull tuition and fee information from Ipeds. So this includes tuition and fee for all CCCU schools, member institutions, including prior CCCU member institutions. And what you're able to see if you look at the median is just a steady increase over time in the posted tuition and fees. Here's an example of the type of custom graph that we're able to provide. There'll be a slide on this at the end. We've plotted Bethel University, and so it allows us to see how has the change in tuition and fees at Bethel University, how does it compare with the CCCU? And so we can see that we have accelerated our tuition a little bit faster than the median at CCCU institutions. This particular slide, again, it includes data for non-survey participants. It includes data for 155 current and former CCCU schools. And what we're looking at is the year-over-year change in the sticker price, the tuition and fee portion for traditional undergraduate programs. And if we go back to 2001, 2 up until 2006 and 7, you can see that it was pretty flat. It was pretty much assumed every year you could raise your tuition by about 6 percentage points, and that was the norm, very flat. Hit the recession, and that median year-over-year change dropped down, and we landed in something that for a couple years was between 4 and 5. And then after 2010, it fell down again, so that by 13, 14, the new norm was around 3 to 4%. And then since 2017, 18, that median year-over-year change in tuition has continued to slide, so that this most recent cycle, the median change was 3 percentage points. Most of us participate in some type of unfunded institutional gift aid. Unfunded meaning it's tuition revenue that's going back in the form of a grant or scholarship to assist incoming and returning students. Again, you can look at over time the discount rate, this unfunded discount rate, how much unfunded institutional gift aid as a percent of overall tuition and fees, very flat prior to the recession. This is an average per enrolled student. And then since the recession, that average continued to increase. And you can see it ramped up, and it's flattened out a little bit for the median for the CCCU. And here you can see an example of another school whose unfunded institutional gift aid is on there as well, and how much that has increased much faster than the median for CCCU institutions. Average federal gift aid over time. Again, if you look at 2009-10, this is the median average federal gift aid. By federal gift aid, most of this is federal Pell Grant, but it includes Supplemental Education Opportunity Grant as well. In 2009-10, that median was $1,585. In the most recent year, it was $1,584. Not a whole lot of change in the amount of federal gift aid that our students are receiving over the last 8 or 10 years. And then a slide on average state gift aid. And this is the average state gift aid per enrolled student in traditional undergrad programs. And again, take a look at that median line. Back in 2002, 2003, the median was $980. By 15-16, it was $950. Not much of a change over a decade. We've seen a little bit of an increase in the last few years, so we're up to the $1,289. But consider this to the increase in tuition and fees over time, and the change in funding on average for our students from federal and state resources has been very, very nominal.
Thank you, Jeff. I'm going to pick up here. And before I rant about loans, let me just add something I should have added at the beginning. And that is, why do we collect all this information directly from schools rather than just pull it from Ipeds? And there's a couple of reasons. The first was, back when we started doing this, the Ipeds had about a 2-year delay in publishing data. So we wanted faster data from Ipeds. But the biggest reason is the preponderance of weekend colleges or adult degree completion programs in our schools. As Jeff mentioned, over 70% of our survey respondents also have a non-traditional undergraduate program. And those programs have totally different, and for most schools, totally different pricing and discounting strategies. And in many cases, when we report data to the federal Ipeds system, the undergrad traditional students and the undergraduate non-traditional students are lumped together. And so that kind of skews the data and makes tracking of this kind of information difficult. Because, for instance, in loans, our adult degree completion students have a different profile, particularly in discount rates, which we'll get to in a couple of minutes. But here's student loans. The point I'd make about student loans over time here is that the national narrative that everyone has heard for a decade is that we're in a student loan crisis. And nothing could be further from the truth, in my opinion, because, and this, Sandy Baum at the College Board has reported this as well, but since the onset of the recession, our students are borrowing no more than they did back 12, 13 years ago. Up until the recession, you see that the average annual loan per enrolled student was increasing up from $3,200 up to $5,900. But since 2008, 2009, the average loan has been flat or even dropped, and we're now down 7% 12 years later in the average amount of loan that our students are borrowing per year. We'll go to the next slide, Jeff, and look at the average debt of graduates. Same kind of story. Up until 2007-8 or 2008-9, the graduates were graduating with increasing amounts of debt, but that's been fairly flat since then. It has increased a little bit, but not a lot. But the real story is that, and these are averages, the real story, well, as I said, the median has been very flat. What is true, and we don't have a slide for this, but at many of our schools, we have some outliers on the far right side of the bell curve who are borrowing way too much. And that's a small group, but it tends to drag up averages that are reported. But the big story on debt is that not only are the amount of debt that our graduates are borrowing pretty flat, but the number of graduates, which is the next slide, has actually declined, number of graduates who have borrowed. And it has dropped from 80% back at recession times to now in the neighborhood of 70%. This is an example again of a customized slide where we superimposed, and here we named ourselves. This was actually Bethel's data. And what this tells me is that we are following the trend of the CCCU schools with fewer of our graduates actually having borrowed. Next slide, Jeff. This is, again, data from all schools, whether they're in the survey or not. This is the 3-year cohort default rate. And this is public information from the federal government. And it shows the distribution of our schools' default rates over the most recent year available. And the national average default rate, which had been, I remember when it was 22%, is now down to just under 10%. About 80% of our schools are under that. In fact, our median is pretty close to the national average median for private 4-year schools. So that's a good sign. Next slide, Jeff. Now we're going to dig into some more analysis here. Over time, the dotted green line is our median net price, and this is the for all of the schools each year that participated in the survey. And the median net price is defined as tuition fees, room and board, minus all gift aid from all sources. And so the rate of the median net price, it's continued to increase. There was a little slowing there in the recession, but then in the last couple of years, there's been some slowing again. And that's the dotted green line. That's the net price that our families are facing. And this is across all of the surveyed schools. The solid green line is something called the wealth index. And we'll unpack that a little more when we get into the institutional financial health section. But for now, the wealth index is the ability of families of dependent students at our schools to pay for college. And it's a hybrid of taking the expected family contribution off of the FAFSA and then making the assumption that non-FAFSA filers are able to pay the whole tuition fees, room and board. And so we create a hybrid metric called the wealth index. And it's very interesting, and again, shows the heavy hand of the recession on recent history in our schools. Up until the recession hit in 07, 08, our family's ability to pay was increasing continually. It actually plateaued and dropped for a while. So for several years in the middle of this chart, you see that family wealth was actually declining. More recently, it has recovered and it's getting closer back up to where our net price is. We'll tease that out in a couple of different ways going forward. However, the big picture here, thanks Jeff, is that what's really changed in the last 20 years is our sticker price. And so the top line there is the tuition fees, room and board median for our schools. And so 20 years ago, the gap between sticker price and net price was about a little over $5,000. Now that gap has increased to substantially higher. It's probably tripled. So it's a whole new ball game with schools increasing discount rates over time. And then the family is between the two green lines. They're facing the net price and their ability to pay with the other green line. Let's move ahead, Jeff. This is busy, but this is essentially similar information. And so the darker green line represents the median net price that our families are facing, and the solid black line is the wealth index over time. What this also adds is to show how much of the aid that the students are getting to fill the gap between net price and sticker price is coming from the institutions and how much is coming from all other sources. We're talking gift aid here. And so at the top of each bar, the diagonal black and white lines show the sum of federal aid, state aid, private gift aid, and then the lighter colored part of the bar is all the institutional discount. Now, we're going to go quickly through 4 more slides that show this same relationship with 4 selected schools. We've anonymized them. So Jeff, if you go to the next one, school number 2 has a little different profile. And I'll just say that if you want to go further with us and order a more customized slideshow, this is the kind of data that you would see for your institution here we stripped off all the identifying information, but you would see all the identifying information for your school and your competing schools. But this is a school that the solid blue line shows the net price that families pay. It has been actually slowly increasing over time up until the last 3 years when it's been fairly stable. And then family ability to pay, the black line, has increased over that period of time. So this is a healthy school. They have had a good experience. The one thing this doesn't show is volume. And so when I say it's healthy from the perspective of an individual student and family. Their ability to come up with the net price has been increasing over time. Next slide shows another school, school number 5. And on the face of it, this looks good from the family perspective as well. So we see that the ability to pay is now up in the range of what the net price is. The next slide, school number 7, not so much. The ability to pay is still somewhat under the net price. And then school number 8 is another school where the ability to pay has crossed over and is now above the net price. Now, this is interesting data to Jeff and I, but the one thing that this doesn't show is volume. So this is a perspective of an average student. So school number 8, if they maintained their volume, would be very healthy financially as looking at net revenue in the aggregate. But let's throw in that next slide, Jeff, which is just a teaser for the institutional financial health area. And this is school number 8, but it shows that their actual net revenue, which is the black line, has actually been declining. So what we take away from this, and this is a short period to unpack this, but there are variables that go into institutional financial health that are different from those that go into the affordability for families. Institutional financial health is composed of price, discount, and volume. And this shows that price and discount can be manipulated, but if you don't have the volume, if you don't have the enrollment, you're still facing declines. I'll unpack this a little more in the next section. Let's go ahead, Jeff.
Just to clarify, this black line now has a different meaning. This is the net tuition revenue here, whereas on the prior slides, that black line was ability to pay. So the net tuition revenue is what we've been focusing on. Okay,
Jeff, you can start this next one.
Institutional financial health, as Dan talked about, volume is key. And so we're going to look a little bit at enrollment as well as the discount rates and then go into the ability to pay conversation. Across the CCCU in traditional undergraduate programs, check out that green line. Back in 2000, 2001, the median CCCU school had 1,373 students. In the most recent survey, the median school had 1,324 students. All of our efforts to try to grow the number of students in our traditional undergrad programs, it may have affected differently at individual schools, but as a sector, no change in the median over almost 20 years. When we look at the distribution of our enrollment, and this is the slide that includes the blue are the students who are in traditional undergrad programs. This pink color in the middle are the non-traditional undergrad, and then the green at the top are the graduate enrollment. And so going back from 2000, 2001 up to 1920, you can see a general growth in the percent of our students who are enrolled in graduate programs. And that's had an impact so that this most recent study is the first time that of the survey participants, just under 50% of the enrollments were represented by traditional undergrad programs. And the rest of the enrollment, bigger chunk with graduate and a sizable portion for non-traditional undergrad programs. The next couple of slides focus on discount rate, and there are a number of different ways that schools may calculate discount rate. We talk about two ways in the survey we do, the unfunded discount rate and a NACUBO. And in both cases, we're taking a look at gift aid divided by tuition and fee revenue. We're not including room or board. And our focus today is going to be on the unfunded discount rate, which is the unrestricted institutional gift aid divided by tuition and fee revenue. The unfunded discount rate does not include funded or endowed or restricted institutional gift aid. It's just looking at the unrestricted or unfunded institutional gift aid. And neither of these calculations factor in employee tuition remission or employee tuition benefit. Over time at our institutions in traditional undergrad programs, this is the unfunded discount rate. And when we look at the median, 25.8, very flat in the early 2000s up until the recession. And then we began to step on the gas a little bit. And from 2006-07 up until about 2012-13, a fairly steady increase. We plateaued a little bit in the early teens, and in more recent years, we have continued to increase the rate at which we're offering unfunded institutional gift aid so that the median for CCCU schools for all students, not just incoming students, is now 47.3%. So $47 out of every $100 of tuition is going back in the form of some type of grant or scholarship. We asked the question, what's the difference for the amount of unfunded discount rate for incoming new students? And the new student target for this past cycle was 51.2, as compared to the overall discount rate for all enrolled students, 47.4 at the median CCCU institution, a variance of roughly 4 to 5 points for the middle half of our schools. If we were to strip out the larger in discounting that we're doing to incoming students and compare that to the non-new students, just the continuing students, that variance would probably be a little bit higher. And that's just indicative of at many of our schools, we offer a larger scholarship to incoming students. And then generally speaking, they get to try to retain that gift aid in subsequent years. Typically, they need to continue to be full-time and in good standing, but we don't typically increase the amount of institutional gift aid for returning students. They live with their grant or scholarship aid in subsequent years. And so as tuition increases for returning students, that reduces the year-over-year discount rate for that student in year 2, 3, or 4. This particular slide is looking only at students who on the FAFSA, or they didn't file a FAFSA, but they're no need. Either the FAFSA says the family can contribute more than the cost of attendance, or they didn't file a FAFSA. And what's of interest is 33%, a third of our schools give non-need-based gift aid to more than 97% of our non-need students. And this is different than the general narrative that you hear of gift aid is supposed to be for needy students. It's very, very common at our institutions that we're giving gift aid to students who are not needy. Third quartile at 99.5%. Almost everybody is getting some type of grant or scholarship at our schools. Go ahead, Dan.
Oh, and this is a change, as you said, Jeff, from 20 years ago, and it is a change that's national and not just at our Christian schools. So.
Yeah.
All right, I think we're ready to move into the wealth category, Jeff. Okay, so we mentioned the wealth index. This is an index we came up with 30 plus years ago, but it's an approximate measurement of the expected parent contribution from non-independent student families, whether or not they show need. And as you look at the distribution of the wealth index on the next slide, a positive variance means that compared to other schools, families are wealthier than the norm. So let's move to the next slide. And this just takes the 55 responding schools from 1920 and plots them with the tuition fees, room and board across the x-axis and the wealth index across the y. And so where you want to be is you want to be above the line, which is the regression line. So Jeff, if you would highlight kind of that spot on the bottom, just north of the $35,000 number there's a school where tuition fees, room and board is about $35,000. And forgot to unplug the landline, so you hear a phone ringing, that's me, it'll go away. But then up straight up north there from that, Jeff, there's another school that's just under 35,000, up even further. And so these schools are the similar price schools, but one has families that can contribute on average about $9,000 a year. The other has families that can contribute about $26,000 a year. So this is a way that we kind of tease out the how our school responds to the natural clientele that we have. And one more pitch for participating in this survey in future years. If you have participated in this, with the materials that you got back in December, you got a labeled version of this display. And so you could see where you ranked with relation to the competition. Next slide, Jeff, is...
Well, Dan, if I could just add one comment, it's helpful to see where you rank. It's also helpful to understand where other schools are at. So when we are exploring ideas of how we might discount differently or add a different strategy, the discounting strategy for the school that Dan pointed out that's down here, their strategy is probably different than the discounting strategy for the school that's up here. So being able to refer to this provides some additional context in making decisions about changes in your discounting strategies.
And this slide is, again, another customized graph, but this shows the family ability to pay changing over time. We've seen this once before, but if you look at the green line, the median line, you see increasing up to the recession, then flat or declining, and now increasing again. And this is where on a customized slide, you plot your school and see how you compare. And this again is Bethel, and we are typically been at the third quartile, and that's about where we are today. Next slide, Jeff. Net revenue over time. In fact, Jeff, I'm going to skip right to the next slide because here's the big story. We're shifting gears now into looking at from this perspective of the college, what is an indicator of institutional financial health? Well, I asked my CFO that question about 20 years ago, a guy named John Bergeson, and he said, we should be increasing our year-over-year total aggregate tuition revenue, net tuition revenue, by the rate of inflation plus 1 or 1.5 points. And he said, if we do that, we are in pretty good shape. And so back 20 years ago, inflation was increasing at 3% per year, sometimes 4%. So a healthy institution back then would have been increasing at 4 to 5% year over year net revenue compared to the previous year. And this is aggregate net revenue. So volume is a factor in determining this. And you see that our median back then was doing that. Our median schools were increasing by over 5%. Then the recession hit. And the year-over-year net tuition revenue started to decline. And then about 2014-15 or 15-16, the median actually crossed below zero, meaning that at that point, half of our schools had reduced net revenue compared to the previous year, and the other half had increased net revenue. And even the schools with increased net revenue, the third quartile dropped from 15% down to under 5% per year. And since the last 3 or 4 years, last 4 or 5 years, it's continued to decline. And as of 1920, more than half of our schools took in less net revenue in the current year than they did in the previous year. And even the third quartile is down to about 2%, a plus 2%. And this is not, inflation is not figured into this, and inflation has been running in the 1.5%, 2% range. So the big story here is that institutional financial health across our sector really took a hit, starting with the recession. And a lot of that I lay at the feet of changing attitudes of families about their willing to sacrifice to go to their first choice college. And that data has been confirmed with the Harry study out of California that a decreasing number of first-year students are going to their first choice college. Let's move on, Jeff. This is probably for your future reference if you want to look at this later, but this shows what we're going to look at school by school in terms of net price. And the things to look at are mainly the green line on top, which is gross tuition and fee revenue year over year. And then the black line in the middle, which is net tuition and fee revenue. And then in this case, the darker green, which is the unfunded institutional gift aid. So let's go to the next slide, Jeff. And this is what's happened in recent years over the median CCCU institution. So the green line and the black line continue to diverge. And we won't go into detail on what all of the stacked bar is there, but as you have opportunity to look at that, you can see that it shows how much of the money comes into the institution from other people's money, federal gift aid, state gift aid, and private gift aid. And then the big bar is the green bar that shows institutional discount. And on top of that, we've stacked the loans. And so here you see what the families are borrowing. Let's move on to the next one. We have the same 4 schools. We're going to show what their perspective, the 4 schools that we showed on the affordability section, what the impact on families was. We're now going to show the impact on the institution. So our first school, which had increasing net price, also has pretty much increasing net revenue. They didn't suffer much of a decline. They were flat after the recession, but actually until this last year had a recovery, and their highest net revenue ever was a year before this most recent year. The gap between the green line and the black line is not so great. In other words, this school has constrained their discounting. And so we would put them in the healthy category. The next one, this is a school that if you go back to the affordability, the actual amount of aid, the net price was being exceeded by the family ability to pay. But for the last 6 or 7 years, the year-over-year change in total net tuition revenue has actually declined at this school, and the gap has widened. So this school is trying to discount their way out of an issue, and the enrollment hasn't come with. The next school, yeah, go ahead.
Here in this dotted area, you see the significant increases year over year in the unfunded institutional gift aid. That's going up and up and up, and that's contributing towards the decline in the net revenue.
Yep. Next school is number 7. And this school, the gap between the green and the black hasn't grown so much, but this school has been in a declining net revenue, total net revenue position since the onset of the recession. And so And here's where the, this school is a good candidate for, a change in strategy. And number 8, this is the one we looked at before. This school, again, looks good from the perspective of the student and family, but actual volume has declined substantially. And what Jeff and I try and tease out is what is causing the decline. And in some of these cases, not all, in some of these cases, we're losing the bottom end of the socioeconomic status. We're losing our Pell recipient population. Not drastically, but the percentage of our enrolled students who are on Pell is declining at some of our schools. And that contributes to our drop in volume overall, in total enrollment overall. And that's what's happening here as well. Next slide, Jeff. You've got this one, and then I'll pick up after that.
So just in terms of review, where we've come thus far, and in particular looking at the institutional financial health. Over the last 17, 18 years, traditional undergrad enrollment at CCCU schools has been flat or declining. Sad reality. Secondly, families, their ability to pay, and this is assuming that you believe what the FAFSA says, that the FAFSA says you can contribute $30,000 a year. My hunch is most families would not concur that they can afford that 30, but we're looking at the results of FAFSA, and that family ability to pay that was flat immediately after the recession, while the median tuition during that time frame increased by over 30% at our schools. So we were digging ourselves into a little bit of a hole after the recession. From fiscal year 15 through 20, more than half of the CCCU undergraduate programs, the traditional undergrad programs, experienced an increased ability of the enrolled students to pay for college. The median increase went up 33%, yet more than half of the schools saw a year-over-year decline in net tuition revenue throughout this period. Enrollment declines at CCCU schools since fiscal year 15, median decline was 6%. And we've seen a decrease in Pell eligible students, as Dan mentioned. That median decline from 15 to fiscal year 20 was a decline of 19%. We've seen an increase in the average unfunded institutional gift aid per enrolled student. The median increase was 24% at the schools from fiscal year 15 to fiscal year 20. So a consistent pattern of trying to give out more and more unfunded gift aid, I believe, in the hope that that's going to translate into larger enrollments. Enrollments going down, unfunded gift aid going up, decrease in the neediest students. And that leads us to this number 4, our massive investment in unfunded institutional gift aid has not resulted in increased net tuition revenue at most CCCU schools.
Thank you, Jeff. We've been whoops. Okay, I'm back online here. All right, thank you. We've been telegraphing this message, but let's dig. We only have 3 or 4 more slides, and then we'll get to your questions. Let's go to the next one, Jeff. We did a deeper dive into, we identified 46 schools who supplied data both in the 20 survey and in the fiscal 17 survey. And we lined them up here from in terms of change over the 3-year period in net tuition revenue, aggregate net tuition revenue. And 63% of the schools, or 29 of them, let's see, get my number right here. 29 schools decreased. And so they're at the top of this chart. They decreased as much as close to 30% over that 3-year period. Down at the bottom of the chart, you'll see the 17 schools that increased over the 3-year period, their net revenue. Now let's go to the next one, Jeff, where we unpack this, and I'll spend just a little time on this. So the 17 schools who increased, their net tuition and fee revenue was up 7.3% over that 3-year period. Their unfunded discount rate, and we highlighted this because this is the smoking gun, I think, actually dropped 1.4 points over the 3-year period. Their enrollment was up 6.8%, so their volume was up. Their tuition and fees was up 10.6%. And the net price paid per student, which is tuition, fees, room and board minus total gift aid, was actually up 12%. And that squares with the increase in fees and the slight decrease in discount rate. The family ability to pay was up 29%, and the percent of students receiving Pell was down 1.8%. Let's compare that, Jeff, with the 29 schools that actually lost revenue. They lost an average of 3.2% over the 3-year period. Their unfunded discount rate was up 5.2%. And Jeff, you can throw the next slide on too to get the comparison. So the variance between the two is, between the winners and the losers here, is 6.4 points. The enrollment declined at the schools. Obviously, this is kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. An enrollment decline contributes to the decline in net revenue. But the tuition and fees went up almost as much at the schools with declining revenue as it did with the schools with increasing revenue. So the tuition and fees is not the secret here. It's the discount rate, which means that the net price paid per student, well, going up only 3 points in 3 years, that's what's contributed to the lower revenue at the lower revenue schools. Family ability to pay went up, but not as much, and the number of students receiving Pell was 0.4. So my conclusion from this slide is that the characteristic that really is common to the schools that are doing the best as institutions is constraining the discount rate. And Jeff, do you want to tease out a little more on the next slides?
Sure. These next 2 slides are similar to the data that Dan just reviewed, and I'm going to jump down to the last 2 bullets. This is the reflecting information on the 17 schools where the with larger aggregate net tuition revenue. And on each of our campuses, there's hopefully a healthy tension between the perspective of enrollment management, which is really focused on we need to grow enrollment in most cases, or at least maintain enrollment, and the perspective of business affairs, which is what's happening with net tuition revenue. And we have this tension going back and forth. So we looked at the schools that participated in the survey that we could identify that they had responded to other survey questions about where does financial aid report. And of the schools where they had an increase in net tuition revenue from 16-17 to 19-20, 31% of the enrollment management schools where financial aid reports to enrollment management had an increase in net tuition revenue, compared to half of the schools where financial aid reports to business affairs, as compared with the schools where they saw a decrease in their total net tuition revenue over the last 3 years. 2/3 of those schools, the financial aid office reports to enrollment management, and we had that same 50% reporting to business affairs. So it's just talking about the importance of these 2 perspectives being heard, and it's just, I don't think there's causality here, but it is very interesting, the significant variance in the schools that did better with their net tuition revenue. A smaller percent of those financial aid reported up through enrollment management than business affairs. Across the board, what we've observed in terms of the total net tuition revenue is that where schools, the increase in the total net revenue, it was more likely, as Dan said, a result of constraining the growth of the unfunded discount rate and a willingness to pass along a greater percent of the tuition increase to students and families. And not just the willingness on behalf of the institution to do that, but also the readiness on the behalf of the students to be able to handle that additional increase, as compared with schools where the aggregate net tuition revenue declined over the same period.
And Jeff, I just interject here that, if if you have a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. And so we're not saying here that finances and the interplay of pricing and discounting is the only or even the primary cause of what schools are healthy and what schools are less healthy, but it is a contributing factor. And the takeaway I have is that the whole top administration, from CFO over to Chief Enrollment Officer and others, need to be of one accord on how they're going to move forward on this. All right.
So in terms of custom presentations, Dan mentioned a couple times the survey data is available and it's been shared with all of the participants. And if any of the schools who participated wanted a copy of the Excel data, the data is put into an Excel spreadsheet, they can just reach out to Steph and Steph would be happy to send that off to them. There also are customized presentations available. As we illustrated, we're plotting your school's information on the longitudinal slides, and then you can also request up to 4 peer institutions to be able to see how their data appears. Thus far, I think we've had 19 schools who have requested that type of presentation. Typically, the price of that is $400. This year with COVID, a lot of our budgets are just gone. So we've reduced that to $99. If your school is interested in that, you can email me at jeffolson@bethel.edu by January 29. This is just, I need to move on and work on other things. So we're saying if you want to do this, get it turned in by January 29th, and then a few days after that, I'll prepare those reports and get them sent out. Appreciate that. And then Dan, if you want to talk about
and then the other thing you may want to consider is if you want, once you have Jeff's customized slideshow, if you want Jeff or I to sit down with you and unpack this and speak to how it affects your institution, we can do that either via Zoom with a group or multiple groups, or through face-to-face visits if that's appropriate or as it becomes appropriate. And those fees start at about $300. And if you have if you're interested in that, and one already has, contact me and we'll line you up. We'll talk through the options of that. I think, Jeff, it is 11:07 in the Central Time Zone, so we have plenty of time for questions. And Steph, I know there's at least one out there. Could you share the first question?
Sure. Do you think the pandemic will force more pressure on universities to level pricing for their traditional on-ground degrees with their non-traditional fully online undergrad degrees?
Jeff, I have a response to that. Do you want to weigh in as well?
Why don't you go ahead, Dan?
Well, I think absolutely yes. You know, and I've been at this business a while, and so I remember back in 1980, there was a book published, I think it was Clark Kerr, it was called 3,000 Futures. And back then, it was the first hint of demographic changes in the size of the college-bound population that was going to come in the 80s. And people were starting to realize that the baby boom that had hit you know, the country after World War II was producing 18-year-olds, but then it was followed by a baby bust. And so one author looked at the 3,000 at that time post-secondary institutions in the United States and said, we're going to have multiple futures, including a lot of them will close. Didn't turn out to be true. Some closed, but not very many. More recently, the same kind of doomsayers have jumped in. You know, McGraw's article from our professor down at Carleton here near our campus talked about the impact of the baby bust that's going to come as a result of the birth dearth of the recession. And that's going to hit about 2025. So there have been doomsayers from time to time. I think the combination of all of this will cause many schools to reconsider pricing and discounting strategies. So the 3 that announced this last fall that they're doing resets, I think will be joined by others for the coming year and years. The specific question was, will schools be wanting to normalize the rate they charge for their online students with their on-campus students. I think there's going to be a whole lot of creative solutions for that. And some may actually go to a la carte pricing, where the course itself, which can be taken now at many of our schools online or face-to-face for the same price, will be supplemented by more additional charges for residential students beyond the room and board for the kind of the campus experience charges. So I think, yes, there'll be quite a bit more of this coming up. Jeff?
A couple other nuances to that. We're seeing pressure just in our non-traditional online programs to further reduce the price there to match what's in the public sector. And so there's the tension on how can we balance our traditional undergrad with non-traditional and the online cost there, but we're also getting pressure to reduce the online expense to get closer to the publics. Internally, the idea that we have a different pricing and discounting strategy for our online non-traditional programs compared to our face-to-face traditional programs, it really creates some functional nightmares on the campus of how do we charge a traditional student an appropriate amount of money to take this online course that the non-traditional person can get much cheaper. So schools have to lean into that as well.
Steph, another question?
What are the indicators or variables that are important for a school to determine if it is surviving in the downturn or is declining?
And again, I think the big one is year-over-year change in your net revenue is from the financial side of things. Now, there are other than financial factors, but from the financial side of things, did you have a greater net revenue this year than you did last year? Are you able to maintain paying your employees and maybe even a raise here and there? If you're not, that's the biggest financial health indicator that I see. Jeff?
I concur. Yeah.
All right. Steph?
Okay, it looks like one more. Could you comment a moment on tuition remissions for employee family members? The person was surprised that your study did not account for a very big wedge of the discount rate. And do you see any indication that schools have large numbers of staff who appear to be motivated to take the jobs largely to obtain tuition remission for their offspring?
Jeff, if you could unpack the change that Bethel made, what is it now, 7, 8, 9, 10 years ago, and we'll speak to that.
Yeah. One of the issues that we have is that schools track the amount they're spending on tuition remission differently. At Bethel University, long ago, we used to not give any dependent student who was going to qualify for tuition remission, they didn't get an academic scholarship. They didn't get any of the normal institutional financial aid, and instead they only got tuition remission. The change that we made about 10 years ago was we began offering those students their normal financial aid package and then stacking on top of that normal financial aid a dollar amount that would get them to the target commitment we made to the parent of the sum of the tuition remission. And what that's done is that's allowed us to recruit those students, and they get the same opportunity to brag about the size of their academic scholarship as their friend across the street. But it also means that we're able to track the additional expense related to employing the parent, and that comes out of a different area in the budget. And that's, frankly, that's gone down quite a bit because we are now tracking the appropriate amount of the unfunded institutional gift aid that we gave to that particular student. So it becomes two chunks of the budget that we're monitoring rather than trying to put the tuition remission all in on top of the discount rate. The other piece where that's significant is the recruiting strategies for somebody who's going to qualify for a full tuition remission. Those recruiting strategies, if we mix that dollar amount in, it might water down our measure of effectiveness of how our normal discounting strategies are. So we want a way to be able to separate those students out of that evaluation.
And then I see the other part of the question, do we see any indication that schools have a large number of staff who appear to be motivated to take the jobs largely due to obtaining tuition remission for their offspring? Jeff, you're closer to that than I am, but back when I was in your role, which I was for 30 years, that was a factor that would come into play and would enable us to attract some employees that we otherwise might not have been able to attract. Do you see any trends recently?
In terms of trends, we haven't really monitored the trends a lot. This is one of the cyclical questions that we ask on the survey. I think we asked it last year ago, to get a benchmark across the CCCU. What are the different policies that institutions have regarding their tuition remission? What's not uncommon is that you have a waiting period. You hire the employee and then you have to work your way up to a full tuition remission over a period of time. And what is less common is after you have received all of these tuition remission benefits, it seems that in most of the campuses, employees can just leave. Whether it's the employee themselves who got their degree, they hired on, got a master's degree, and as soon as they finish their degree, they move on, and there's no penalty associated with that tuition remission.
Jeff, if you would go to the next slide, down at the bottom here, Jeff referenced the fact that a year ago we asked this question, and there's quite a bit of unpacking that can be done. So if you're interested in following up on this, go to the website there, Bethel Study Presentations, www.bethel.edu/institutional-data-research/Bethel-study. And you will see there, eventually you'll see today's presentation. It'll take us, depending on how fast IT is working, a couple of days or a couple of weeks to get it posted. But you'll see the other presentation, the one that was targeted at financial aid people in December of 2020, and then also the past versions of that. So you would go to the past versions of the financial aid survey for 2019, and you'll find an unpacking of this one. Any other questions, Steph?
That is all that I have, unless somebody has another one.
Well, I thank you, unless there's more coming in. I thank you for your time today. And this is our contact information. If you have questions for Dan or Jeff, just contact us at our emails here. And then for those of you in the financial aid area, feel free to join the discussion list on the CCCU e-list. And for the rest of you, have a good, safe week coming up. We live in interesting times, and we're looking forward to getting through January. Any last words, Jeff?
No, that's all. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. We're signing off.